Hi, everyone. This is Ed. I'm your Q&A moderator for today's session of OLLI Online. I'd like to welcome everyone. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our guests who have heard about OLLI through the Austin American Statesman and are checking everything out today. I'm sure you'll enjoy today's lecture. So with that, I'm going to turn the session over to Dr. Brands, who will be talking to us today on Brand's first law of history.
Thank you, Ed, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to UT OLLI for hosting this event. And thank you for everybody who's tuned in. It gives me an opportunity to test some ideas that I have been working on during, well, the many years now that I have been thinking about and teaching history. When I was a young man, filled with the ambition of the young, I had this, I'll call it a life goal, or at least something that I wanted to do. I thought something big to sink my teeth into. I wanted to figure out how the world worked. And I realized that everybody, from the time they're very young, works on trying to figure out, how do things fit together? How does my world work? But I had a bigger plan than that. I had this idea that the world sort of worked like a mechanism. I confess that I was kind of an engineering sort of kid when I was growing up. I was always tinkering with things and building go-karts and this, that, and taking apart washing machines and seeing how things worked. And it gave me no end of satisfaction when I would discover how something worked. And there were moments of discovery that, well, gave me a great deal of satisfaction, although I probably shouldn't have enjoyed the satisfaction. One particular example, when I was just learning how to read, I and my younger brother, who is 2.5 years younger than me, found ourselves sitting in the front seat of my mother's car, a station wagon. And this would have been right around 1960 or so. And we were sitting there waiting for my mom. Now, in those days, it was less a big deal for kids to be sitting in a car by themselves than it is today. And I'll say that the car was in the garage of our house, and we were going to go to the grocery store or someplace. And for some reason, David, my brother, and I were eager to go. And so there we were, sitting in the front seat. And I suspect that I exercised the prerogatives of the elder and insisted on getting the window seat in the front. Of course, this was in the days of the bench front seat. So it was 3 wide, or if you're kids, you could fit 4 wide. It was, of course, in the days before seatbelts. And so anyway, I sat by the window, and David sat in the middle, of course, with the shorter legs and all. His feet would get up on the transmission, the drive shaft hump and all that, no big deal. And we were waiting for my mom, and I guess she got delayed for something or other. The phone call came in or something like that. And we were sitting there in the car. And I remember looking at the dashboard and wondering what all the knobs were for. And there was one particular, actually, it wasn't a knob so much as it was a handle. And I was trying to make out what it said, what the label on the handle was. And I looked at it and I sounded it out. We learned reading by the phonics method. And it said, B-R-A-K, so B-R-A-K-E, so brake, okay, and a brake, I guess I know what brakes are maybe. And then it said R-E-L-E-A-S-E. And I read out brake release. I wonder, I said to myself, is that really the brake release? I wonder what happens if you release, if you pull the lever. Do the brakes really release? Now, this is where younger brothers come in handy, because I decided that I would put David up to doing my dirty work. And David, with the innocence of I guess he was probably 4 years old, 5 years old, I said, David, reach over, and he was closer to it anyway. I said, reach down there and pull on that lever. So David pulled on the lever. And there was a satisfying kind of clutch as though something actually released. But this was followed, in my case anyway, by real disappointment because nothing happened. And I thought, dang, I thought I had figured out what that was. This was a brake release, and you release the brakes and something's supposed to happen, but nothing had happened. So I thought, oh, wait a minute, maybe the brake release needs a little help. So I got out of the car and I went to the front of the car and I gave the car a push. Now, I should say that the garage floor where the car was sitting was raised about, a foot or so from above the street. And there was just a short driveway that crossed the sidewalk and then went out to the street. And it was a very quiet residential street, no traffic. And so I pushed on the car. Now, when you're 7 years old, this is one a big Ford station wagon. Nothing happened. I could not push the car. And I thought, darn, I don't know. I'm really disappointed. I thought I had figured this thing out. So I thought, okay, I'll give it one more try. And I put my feet on the bumper of the car, both feet, and I leaned so that my back was against the wall of the garage. The car was parked that close. And this way I got all the leverage of my legs. And I pushed, and to my delight, the car started rolling. It started rolling backwards, slowly out of the garage, down the slope, into the street. And David was sitting there in the front seat, wide-eyed. I was trying to figure out what was going on. And I was so pleased because, yeah, that had been the brake release. Now, my satisfaction was somewhat diminished about 3 or 4 seconds later. All this was happening kind of in slow motion. And the car slowly rolled across the street, and it came to a stop, having lightly hit a neighbor's car across the street. And this was all perfectly silent because no engine was going on. And about this time, my mom came out of the door into the garage and looked, and she saw no car. And she thought, oh my, what's happening? She saw me standing there, and I probably should have had the good sense to appear somewhat shamefaced, but I don't know that I did. And then she looked, and she could see David sitting in the front seat of the car, and the car sitting out in the middle of the street. Well, needless to say, my mother was fairly aghast at all of this. And so she asked me what happened. And I confessed that I said, David pulled a lever in the car. And so I really should not have done this to my mother. But I was 7 years old because for a long time, she felt kind of burdened with a sense of guilt at having let her children get in the car when she wasn't there. And apparently the car wasn't in gear or something. I knew nothing about all these other complications. And it was only very much later that I confessed to this. And my mother still was rather, well, at that point, she became annoyed with me, and especially because she had thought that it was her fault and all this stuff. Anyway, that was the kid who went off to college and decided, you know what, I'm going to figure out how the world works. Now, it was my misfortune, maybe, or I don't know, it was my good fortune. It was my fortune to fall into a history class before I ever took political science or economics. If I had taken a political science class or an economics class, it's quite possible I never would have gone into history because I didn't know anything about the difference between history, usually considered one of the humanities, and political science and economics, considered social sciences. Because in trying to figure out how the world works, what I was really trying to do was kind of come up with a model or a theory of sort of really human behavior. And I wasn't really talking about the physical world works and how human beings interact. So if I had taken probably an economics class or a political science class, even a sociology class or something like that, I might very well have gone into that field. Instead, I took a history class and I really liked it. Now I have to say that I had a pre-existing inclination in favor of history. I'd been interested in history since I was a kid. And I thought of history simply as these really interesting stories about the past. And that, in fact, was what the history classes that I took in college were too. I thought, this is great. I wasn't initially a history major. I was initially a mathematics major. And I liked math. They have sort of a very different style of thinking. I just liked it a lot. I've been good at math, and so I thought that was fun. But I always would take history classes just to fill out my course schedule, and because I thought, well, this is interesting stuff. And the reason that I say that it was my fortune to go one direction or the other, because I had intended to sort of develop, I thought I was going to develop this theory of the world, this theory of human behavior, and that's what social scientists do. But instead, I went into history. And historians are not model builders. They're not theorists. The basic difference between a historian and a political scientist, if we're looking, let's say, at the realm of political history, or for that matter, a historian and a sociologist, if we're looking at social history, or a historian and an economist, if we're looking at economic history, or a historian and any kind of social scientist, is that the social scientist is more interested in the theory, the model, than in the particular incidents that are used to provide evidence in support of the model. Whereas the historian is generally willing enough to look at theories, but the theory isn't the goal of the historian. One way to put it is that a political scientist looks at the French Revolution in order to develop a theory of revolutions. The historian looks at theories of revolutions to understand the French Revolution. So the historian is the particularist, whereas the social scientist, be that person a sociologist, economist, political scientist, is the generalist and wants to generalize. And it really has everything to do with what it is you're trying to discover. Now, it turned out that going into history was a bit of a wrong turn for somebody who wanted to figure out how the world works, because I learned a lot about a lot of different things in history, but turns out I wasn't in a field and then eventually in a profession that is particularly interested in these big theories. Now, this wasn't always so. And there is a branch of history that, at least there are a branch of historians who consider themselves social scientists. And they're really kind of more interested in the theoretical stuff, in building the models for understanding lots of things than most historians are. There was a time in the past when historians in general started to think, there should be a theory of history. There should be a model of history. There should be laws of history. And the model that they were drawing on was the example of physics. And 500 years ago, 400 years ago, 300 years ago, people who were interested in learning just about the world typically called themselves philosophers. This is why the advanced degree in anything that's not strictly scientific, and in some cases, actually, maybe it's not engineering, even the sciences, the terminal degree, graduate degree, is Doctor of Philosophy. Benjamin Franklin, who was, we would call him a scientist these days if you're alive today, but he called himself a philosopher. And philosophy was simply the love of knowledge. That's what the Greek root means. But it was in the Enlightenment period, starting in about the 1600s and continuing the 1700s and 1800s, that science kind of went its own way. And what the scientists did was they really focused on developing laws laws that would, well, explain the world, or at least explain a small subset of the world. And the best example of this was Isaac Newton and his law of universal gravitation. So people knew that, by this time, people knew that the planets orbited the sun and the moon orbits the earth and so on. And they didn't really have an idea of why, and they didn't even have a very good idea of sort of how it happens and how we can extrapolate from the past to the present to the future. Now, in fact, one of the secrets of the success of the scientists was they stopped asking why. They simply asked how in a very particular way. And so when Newton came up with his beautiful law of gravitation, let's say beautiful from a mathematical and physics standpoint, it's a very simple law. You can write it out in a single equation. I mean, that became the model of a physical law, a law of physics. And it was extraordinarily successful, not only in explaining the past and the present, but here's the key. Here's the reason that science became more powerful, more celebrated, that it could predict the future. So Isaac Newton's law of gravitation, it works, forward and back. There's no time element in there. It just says that, okay, if you have these bodies, here is the force that exerted between the two. And if one of them is already in motion, as the planets already are in motion, then you can predict the force on that planet, and therefore you can predict the trajectory of this. And it turns out, actually I shouldn't say it turns out, it was already known that the planets orbit in elliptical paths. And from this, actually, Newton was able to sort of reverse engineer and come up with this law of gravitation that explained that. But it not only explained what was happening, what had happened, it predicted what was going to happen in the future. And so to a remarkably precise degree, all of a sudden, astronomers were able to say that Jupiter will be right there at that particular time, and that there will be a solar eclipse that will cast a shadow across this portion of North America at that particular minute on this particular day. And there was remarkable success in this. And people who can predict the future, boy, those are the folks you want to hang out with. Because all of a sudden, if you know what's going to happen when other people don't, you have a great deal of power. If I knew what the stock market was going to do in the next week, and I was really confident in the answer, I could make tons of money. But nobody does. And to give you a very timely example, do you know who the next president of the United States is going to be? If you really know, then you have access to some, theory of behavior or some information that the rest of us don't have. So, we know how we got here, and we know that there's going to be a result, but the result could come within the next 6 or 8 hours. It might take longer than that. But at this point, it is extremely up in the air. Nobody knows. But if you knew to a certainty that Joe Biden was going to be next president, Donald Trump was going to get reelected and continue to be president, you could parlay that into success in the stock market. Because if a Democrat wins, the stock's going to be one thing. You can guess this reasonably. Likewise for the Republican. Anyhow, so that's what historians wanted. Historians wanted some of that stuff. They wanted some of the power, the recognition, even the money, the wealth that goes to the science was going to the scientists who could write these laws that would predict behavior. If you in almost any field, with a striking exception of history, but in any field of intellectual endeavor these days, the highest achievement, the greatest award, is the Nobel Prize. There's no Nobel Prize for history, but it's striking that the Nobel Prizes were funded by Alfred Nobel, and he got all his money from producing dynamite. He used the knowledge of chemistry as a science to be able to manufacture this very powerful, quite literally, stuff. And it made him, millionaire many times over. And so then he can bestow all this good on other people. So historians started thinking, we ought to do some of that. And so historians began imagining that there could be laws of human behavior. There could be laws of history. And so they tried proposing various laws. And so there were laws of revolutions, and there were laws of cultural development. And there were laws, probably the most ambitious, the most comprehensive of the historians developing laws was Karl Marx. And Karl Marx had this whole set of laws, this model of economic and political development that described the various past stages of political and economic development, and then accounted for the present, and then predicted the future. And as the scientists tried to isolate the driving force of, it could be of a chemical reaction, or gravity as the force that governs the behavior of the planets, Marx identified the law of, the law of materialism, that everything in society is governed by the material relations. And forget things like religion, forget things like philosophy and art. Those are simply outgrowths of what the material conditions in society dictate. And it's all a matter of who owns what, who works for who gets the profits, who suffers the losses, all of this stuff. Now, Marxist theory demonstrated some of the problems of historical theory. And the fundamental problem, a fundamental problem, was the fact that Marx had a dog in this fight. Marx wanted to see a proletarian revolution. He wanted some of the actors, one of the classes in his class struggle, wanted one of the classes to come out ahead. He was rooting for the proletariat, the workers. Now, when Isaac Newton was describing the laws of motion of the planets, he wasn't rooting for Jupiter. Jupiter, I hope you beat Saturn around the sun, or something like that. The scientist was able to stand apart because the scientist, a chemist, doesn't have any preference for hydrogen or oxygen, when hydrogen and oxygen come together, or when water splits to produce the two. It's just, that's over there and I'm here. But one of the problems with theories of history is that the people making the theories are immersed in the history themselves. And it's really, I have discovered, having been a historian now for 35 years, so I'm a member of the Guild, that it's the rare historian who is not rooting for somebody or some group in the past. Now, I'm going to raise my hand and say, I'm one of the ones who's not rooting for anybody in the past. When I say this, a lot of people respond, "Are you kidding yourself?" But I really don't think I am. Or at least what I'll say is that I happen to think, this is my personal preference, I think it is incumbent on the historian not to have a dog in the fight, not to be rooting for one side or the other. The historian is simply the observer, the analyst, the chronicler. Let other people choose their sides. I wrote a book about Franklin Roosevelt, and I described the New Deal in a great deal of detail. And I didn't take a position in the book on whether the New Deal was a good deal or a bad deal. And I'm still willing to argue either side of it. But the point that I did make in the book was the New Deal, whether it was a good deal or a bad deal, at least was a big deal. And so it's an important thing, and anybody needs to understand it. So anyway, as Marxism demonstrated, one of the problems with history is that most historians have this temptation to shape the theories to produce the outcomes that they favor, which, it's sort of like predicting who's going to win the World Series if you've got money on one side or the other. So anyway, that was part of the problem that these would-be historical lawmakers, these historical theorists, ran up against. But there was actually a more fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem was that history is simply a lot harder than physics. Now, if you look at the people who win the Nobel Prize in physics, they're really smart. And they come up with abstruse theories about this, that, and the other thing. So I'm not saying that physicists aren't smart. I'm just saying that you could even take those people and apply them to history. And, well, there's probably a reason that they went into physics. Because history deals with not atoms. An atom of hydrogen is pretty much like any other atom of hydrogen. A proton is a proton. But human beings are all different. Furthermore, where atoms, neutrons, don't have minds of their own, humans do. And so humans, they can decide to do things or not do things. And as soon as you make a prediction that humans are going to do X, Y, or Z, the humans that you're predicting about will get wind of that and say, oh, wait a minute, maybe I'm not. It's a little bit like trying to predict the behavior of the stock market. I keep coming back to this because, boy, if a historian, an economic historian, a historian of finance could come up with a theory of stock prices that really worked, then that person could become really rich because you would know ahead of time how things are going to move, and you would place your bets, you would make your investments accordingly. But the trouble is that as soon as you make a prediction, then all sorts of other people start acting on that prediction. And they will have their own ideas whether they want to make that prediction come true or that prediction not come true. And people will bet both for and against a rise in prices. They're the bears and the bulls in the stock market. So there is this fundamental problem that humans are really hard to deal with. Now, that does raise the philosophical question of, is there such a thing as free will? Because, there are many days when I think there is no such thing as free will, because how could there be? So Pierre Laplace, a French physicist and scientist, philosopher, came up with this idea of the system of the world. And it was a physics-based system of the world. But he thought that it could extrapolate to human behavior as well, because, he reasoned, humans are made up of atoms and molecules, and therefore they behave according to the laws that govern atoms and molecules. And Laplace asserted that if it was possible to know, now leaving the humans aside for a moment, but if it was possible to know the position and the current velocity, momentum, and so on, the current motion of every particle in the universe at a given time. So you know where everything is. You got this snapshot of the universe at right now. And not only is it a snapshot, you know which direction everything is going. And you know the applicable laws of physics. Then, said Laplace, you could predict the entire future of the universe essentially to infinity. Now, the problem with it, the reason Laplace couldn't do it is that certainly in those days, he didn't know the position of all of the bodies in the universe, and he didn't know their motion. But there's a story that's told that Laplace presented this idea to Napoleon, the French emperor. And Napoleon objected slightly and said, Monsieur, I see no place in your theory for God. And Laplace is supposed to have responded, Your Highness, I have no need of that hypothesis. So the scientists, at least as scientists, could take God out of the picture. Historians had a harder time. Historians had a harder time because whether or not there actually is a God, humans, a lot of humans believe there is, and they conduct their lives accordingly. So all of this is by way of explaining that this idea that historians had in about the middle of the 19th century, that there could be laws of history comparable to laws of physics, ran up against the reality that whatever laws anybody came up with, including Marx, they just didn't predict stuff accurately. The test of a theory is, can it predict something that hasn't happened yet or something that hasn't been observed yet? So one of the key tests of Einstein's special theory of relativity was that it predicted that light would bend when it went around a massive object. And so there was, and ordinarily you can't see this because, and the massive objects in the universe are typically stars or galaxies or something like that. And ordinarily you can't see the very slight bending that gravity causes in light beams because they have to pass really close to the stars. But there's a moment when our star, the sun, is darkened in an eclipse. And in that moment, you could see, you could detect, if you know what you're looking for, you could detect the bending of a beam of light coming from beyond the sun. And Einstein's theory predicted, how much bending there would be. And so scientists, they were all excited. They got out and said, we're going to test this. We're going to see if the theory predicts this thing we haven't observed, predicts the future. And in fact, it did. And when it did, Einstein's theory of relativity all of a sudden became, wow, this is a really big deal. And Einstein won one of those Nobel Prizes. So predicting the future, that's what we're talking about. Now, I have to say that I'm a historian, and so I went down the historian path. But I have a lot of friends who are political scientists and economists. And occasionally I will sit in on PhD defenses and the like with the social scientists. And in one of these defenses, a political science defense, I came upon a concept that when I heard it, I broke out laughing. And I couldn't figure out, I thought, really? And the concept was retrodiction. And, prediction, I get that. You say what's going to happen in the future. Retrodiction, it's predicting the past. I thought, well, how hard is that? You already know what happened. But it turns out it's a legitimate concept because when you're developing a theory of political development, let's say, or a theory of economic development, or something like that, you say, okay, these are the variables that are important, and these are the results that would that occur when these variables are combined in certain ways. And so the way you sort of give your theory a trial run is you apply it to the past. And if it accurately predicts things that you already know have turned out, then you think, okay, maybe the theory is right. And then you say, okay, now let's test it on the future. Now, the real test, of course, is, does it predict the future? Historians had their theories of the future, and they never really panned out. Or at least they never panned out in sufficient detail to do anybody any good. So, for example, economic historians in the 1920s, for that matter, in the 1990s, again in the early 2000s, predicted that this boom in the stock market, in the case of the early 2000s, this boom in the real estate market can't last forever. It's a bubble, it's gonna burst. They said, it's gonna happen. But they started saying that the bubble in the 1920s was gonna burst about 1925. And the stock market doubled in price between there and when it actually did burst. Same thing in the 1990s. Everybody knew there was a bubble, but if you get out too soon, then you miss a lot of the profits. So yeah, the economic historians had this theory, this law of history, that bubbles always break, but they can't tell you when they're going to break. And so unless you know with some specificity, even get it down to a week or a month or two, that would help. But until you can get it there, it doesn't do you any good. It's simply too vague. It's too approximate. So all of this is a long way of saying that I never did quite figure out how the world works. I never came up with my theory, my comprehensive theory or model of history. But I did, over this long period of time, I made some observations on history. And I have developed what I call Branz's laws of history. Now, I call them Branz's laws of history, not because I'm especially proud of them, not that I'm trying to claim ownership of them, not that I'm trying to copyright or trademark them, but simply because they are my idiosyncratic observations of human behavior. And I don't want anyone to get the idea that historians around the world, historians around the United States, historians around Austin are expected to buy into this. No, this is just my way of looking at the world. And my first law of history is that there are no laws of history. Now, that might sound as though, okay, well, so it took you a long time to get to this point, Branz, so why didn't you just tell us that at the beginning and we could have been done with this in 5 minutes? Well, first of all, I'm sort of explaining to you why there are no laws of history, but we don't stop there. Because historians, I as historian, other historians, those historians who consider themselves humanists rather than social scientists, were okay with there not being laws of history, at least not laws that are like the second law of thermodynamics, which predicts that the universe is gradually fading into entropy. Actually, though, that's one that the historians have applied to their work again and again. So, and it's not like, the uncertainty principle of quantum physics. Although there's another one that historians have used, at least metaphorically. So there is in historians still this desire to come up with principles or patterns. So my first law of history is, again, I'm just calling mine because nobody else is expected to agree with this or buy into it or anything. But my first law of history is that there are no laws of history, no laws of history in the sense of physical laws that you can count on, that you know that, okay, this is going to happen. Oh, I should say something else about those laws of physics. They have to happen every single time for them to count as laws. So if, every day for the last 300 millennia, the moon has gone around the earth in the way it does. Well, if tomorrow the moon just should so happen to say, I'm not going to do it anymore, in reversed course, and then maybe the day after got back on the original track, okay, then that law of gravity would be exploded because the law always has to work. A single counterexample explodes the law. This is why there's advance in science, and this is why scientists themselves, they will use law as shorthand, but what they're really describing is a theoretical description of what happens. And they know that this is always tentative. So Newton's law of physics was the best there was until Einstein came along. And it turns out that Newton's law couldn't describe that gravitational bending of light that Einstein's law could. And so it's still used, Newton's law is still used, well, actually it's not used that much at all, because even for sending satellites, they have to factor in relativity. So the law is still there as a first approximation, but we've got a better one, so we move forward. When historians, they'll talk about laws of diminishing returns, economic historians and things like this. but they don't expect their laws to happen every time. So a theory of revolutions, if it explains 9 revolutions and doesn't get the 10th right, historians would still be thrilled because, wow, that's a really good theory of revolutions that explains that many, 9 out of 10. In this case, this is why some of the aspects of quantum theory come in, because quantum theory is less deterministic, particle by particle, than it is statistical. So if you take a bunch of particles, then the chances of these things happening are this much, and so on. And so if you look at things in the mass, then you can make predictions. But for any particular one, you can't tell where this particular neutron is going to go. It's, statistically, a bunch of neutrons are going to do something over a given period of time, but you can't tell where any single one is going to go. The same thing applies a little bit, I guess, to meteorology. And that is when the meteorologist says there's a 30% chance of rain tomorrow, what does the meteorologist mean? That it's going to rain or it's not going to rain? No, it doesn't mean either one. It says basically that on past days, when the conditions looked like this, 30% of the time it rained and 70% it didn't. And so if it doesn't rain tomorrow, are you going to be surprised? No, because there was a 70% chance it wasn't going to rain. If it does rain tomorrow, are you going to be surprised? Well, maybe a little bit, 30%, but still, that's 3 out of 10. So it gives you an idea of what to expect if you aggregate a whole lot of different instances. So, historians can kind of get into that, and that's why I say there are no laws of history, but there are patterns. And the patterns of history don't tell you what's going to happen in any given instance. But they do allow you to fit the instances into a broader scheme of things so that they make some broader sense. History isn't just one damn thing after another, as has been said by various people at various times. No, there is a cause and effect relationship. I'll digress here briefly. So I teach students at UT, and one of the things a lot of students bring from high school is the idea that history is this discipline where you learn facts and you learn dates and you try to put the facts to the dates, and so that's what history is all about. And I explained to them early on, so I teach a lot of freshmen, and I explained early on that I care nothing for dates in history. I don't care that you know that such and such happened on a particular date. The only reason that dates matter at all in history is that they allow you to keep the order of events straight. Now, the order of events is important. So it's important that Abraham Lincoln was elected president before South Carolina seceded from the Union, because in fact, it was Lincoln's election that triggered South Carolina's secession. If you somehow reverse them, it doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. So the fact that the election of Lincoln occurred in November of 1860, if America had been on a system that said elections were going to be in March of the year, then Lincoln would have been elected in March of 1860, and South Carolina would have seceded in, let's say, April of 1860, and things would have gone from there. So the absolute date is not important, it's just the order of events. So there are patterns. And since I've called this lecture Brand's first law of history, you might guess that there are other laws of history. But this first one I have to put first because it's really a disclaimer. I'm not trying to claim too much for this, but I'll briefly share what some of the other laws of history are. And they actually, at this point, I think number nine of them. And I didn't want to get 10 because that would perhaps seem presumptuous, 10 commandments, 10 laws of history. The premier of France during World War I, Georges Clemenceau, when he heard that Woodrow Wilson had issued a statement of American war aims, which Wilson called the 14 points, or it was soon called the 14 points. Clemenceau is supposed to have stroked his chin and said, the good Lord gave us 10 commandments, and we've broken every one. President Wilson has given us 14. We will see. So I stopped short of 10. I thought, nah, 10's not so good. So I think I'm up to 9 about now, and this is a work in progress. And so I'll share with you just a couple. I'll tell you, for example, you certainly would be entitled to know what the second law of history was. My second law of history was, and actually I have to confess that I would be a little bit disappointed if you didn't ask or be curious about the second law of history. My second law of history is that it's stated very succinctly. It's complicated. That's the second law of history. It's complicated. And you might very well ask, what's complicated? And my response would be, everything's complicated. Everything in human behavior is complicated. Everything in history is complicated. And you might say, well, how complicated is complicated? And I would respond, more complicated than you think. And you might respond, well, how do you know how complicated I think it is? And I would say, no matter how complicated you think it is, it's more complicated than that. Now, the reason I say this is that it is my observation that things are really complicated in history. And the more you know about them, the more complicated they become. Now, I will say from this that this is one of the reasons that a lot of people find history frustrating, because a lot of people look to history for guidance regarding the present and the future, and that's fair enough. But the kind of guidance they're looking for is, okay, Brands, who's going to win the election that's culminating today? I've studied presidential history. I know a fair amount of how elections work and what influences impinge on elections, and a little bit about voter behavior and stuff like that. And I will tell you that I have my notions. I could make a forecast the way the meteorologist makes a forecast, but I have no particular confidence, and I don't have sufficient confidence that I would wager a lot of money on my outcome. But I will tell you this, that, okay, today at 1:48 on election day, I don't know who the next president of the United States is going to be. But I expect that I'll stay at this history business for a while. And so within a year, certainly within 4 or 5 years, I will explain with some degree of confidence why the election turned out the way it did. It's sort of an occupational temptation. I'll call it even an occupational failing of historians who cannot tell you today what's going to happen tomorrow. But the day after tomorrow, they will tell you why what happened was inevitable. Because we explain things that happen. So why is it that I can't tell you? Why is it that things are complicated? Why? This is the basic problem with historical theories. And it relates to some of the other stuff that I said earlier. Things are really complicated, and you have to know everything there is to know to be able to make a reliable prediction. But you can't know everything there is to know about the people, what's going through their heads, what influences are acting upon them. You simply cannot know all that stuff. And I think it's probably fair to say that most people don't really know all there is to know about their own behaviors. Why do I do what I do? And there are reasons why we do, but some probably we're not aware of. Some of them act subconsciously. So how much harder is it to try to predict the behavior of other people? And so there's another way of framing this, and that is that here's both the allure of history as a way of viewing the present and potentially predicting the future, but also the inevitable failing of history to do that. And that is that everything that happens now is like something that happened in the past, but it's not exactly like anything that happened in the past. So the current election, It's like elections. It's a little bit like the election of 1932, where the incumbent, Herbert Hoover, was roundly criticized for his failure to deal with the stock market crash and the depression that followed. President Trump has been roundly criticized for his failure to deal with the COVID epidemic. So it's, if it turns out that Joe Biden is elected and he's going to be the next president of the United States, I will be tempted to say, when bad things happen, incumbents get the blame and the challengers win. It happened to Herbert Hoover. It happened to the elder George Bush. A recession came along in 1991, and he lost the election of 1992. So it will fit in with that pattern. But the thing is that I don't know, is COVID actually like the stock market crash? Is it like the recession? I mean, how much is it like the stock market crash of 1929? How much is it like the recession of 1991? The other thing is, I'll certainly not be the first person to say this, but we've never had an incumbent, a president like Donald Trump. And if there are rules or expectations that apply to previous presidents, he's broken many of them. And so they probably don't apply here. Things that previous presidents would have done, might have done, or did, that alienated their supporters, haven't alienated Donald Trump's supporters. So everything that happens, an election in 2020 is like previous elections, but it's also different. And you never know until things actually play out whether the similarities or the differences are more important. And until you do, you can't make any confident prediction of what's going to happen. So my second law is it's complicated. And it's always more complicated than you think. And people who go back to history looking for, okay, so what does history tell us about this, that, or the other thing? Well, it tells you a lot of things. And, when people look back I recently wrote a book about John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. So it's about the Civil War. And the question of what was the Civil War really about? Was it about slavery or was it about states' rights? And the answer was both. It was about slavery and it was about states' rights. Well, typically when people go back to the past, when people look to history, they want one answer or the other. And in the sciences, and I'll close with this and then take questions. In the sciences, there's a principle called Occam's razor, named for William of Occam, a scholastic philosopher. And the principle of Occam's razor says that given a variety of explanations, choose the simplest one. Basically, get rid of complications in explanations, in theories. And it works great in the sciences because what you really want to do is zero in on that one thing that is critical. But Occam's razor utterly fails. In fact, it's counterproductive when you're trying to explain things in history. In fact, in history, the more explanations, the better. So when either Joe Biden or Donald Trump wins the election, it will be because a whole lot of different people having different motivations for choosing that particular candidate chosen. And Joe Biden, let's say he wins, will be chosen because he's a Democratic moderate. It will be, some will vote for him. Some people will vote for him because he seems to be a decent guy. Some people will vote for him because he's from Delaware. Some people will vote for him. And you don't have to choose. You should not choose. You mislead yourself to choose a single explanation. Now, it's going to be tempting. And as I say, in debates over the Civil War, if you want a good debate, say, was it about slavery? Was it about states' rights? The idea that it's about both, it's always about both. And in fact, if it's not just a sort of a true-false question, if it's a multiple choice question, the right answer for the historian is all of the above, because the more explanations, the merrier. It doesn't get you any closer to a theory of history, but it probably gets you closer to an accurate explanation of that particular moment in history that you're looking at. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and see if anything that I said provoked reactions, comments, questions from you in the audience.
All right, thank you, Dr. Brands. So far the most burning question has been, what's the title of the book that's directly behind you?
Oh, well, all right. It happens to be a book of mine, Dreams of El Dorado. It's a history of the American West. And it's not actually my newest book. My newest book is The Zealot and the Emancipator. And that one's the one about John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. The reason this one is behind me is that I really like the cover on this one. And it just sort of goes better with these two photographs I have here. The Zealot and the Emancipator is darker. It's not as attractive a cover.
Okay, so let's jump into the election, since that's kind of on everybody's mind. And we had a question that says there's been a lot of discussion about shy Trump supporters in 2016 that that affected the 2016 presidential election. Did election forecasters learn from that history?
Yeah, what they learned is something that they already knew, and that is there's a big difference between political polls and the actual poll, the voting poll. And a reason, again, with history, you shouldn't say the reason. A reason that the pollsters got it wrong was Donald Trump was a different kind of candidate than they had dealt with before. And so pollsters had made a habit of trying to correct for people saying that, yeah, I'm almost certainly going to vote, but then they don't show up. Or I've never been able to figure out an incentive for anybody who's answering a poll to say, I'm going to vote for candidate A, when in fact they're going to vote for candidate B. It's really, I think, more a matter of they're going to say, I'm going to vote because they think it makes them sound good. I'm a good civic-minded citizen, but really they don't vote. So that's one of the things that caused the pollsters to get it wrong. I mean, the other thing is that in the case of 2016, there really did, well, in the case of 2016, and it's always crucial when you have an open election, that is, when there's no incumbent. Because in American presidential politics, candidates get elected the first time on a promise. So they make a promise. They're going to do this, that, or the other thing. They get reelected or not on their performance. When you have an incumbent, you're dealing with a known quantity. And the vote for reelection is basically a referendum. Did you like the performance of the candidate? And this current election is a referendum on Donald Trump's first 4 years as president. In 2016, there was no incumbent. And so Hillary Clinton was not president, and Donald Trump was not president. And so in both cases, you're dealing with unknowns. Now, Donald Trump was the more unknown because he hadn't been in politics at all, whereas Hillary Clinton had been around for a long time. And so it probably didn't work to her advantage, but at least people, but even then, we don't know how Hillary Clinton would have been as president. But so this election is quite different than 2016 in that it, I think, is primarily a referendum on, do you like what Donald Trump did during his first 4 years? And this is one where, until now, I have been able to dodge questions on the meaning of the Trump presidency, because one of the hats that I wear is as a presidential historian. And so I get this question pretty often. And I've been able to dodge it until now by saying, it's too soon to tell. This is the historian's dodge generally. It's always too soon to tell. It was Zhou Enlai, the Chinese leader, was asked at one time, what's the meaning of the French Revolution, which had occurred in the 1780s and 90s? And he is supposed to have said, it's too soon to tell. Well, in the case of any president, during a first term, it is too soon to tell. And here's why. Because if the president fails of re-election, if Donald Trump does not get re-elected, basically then voters, or at least a working majority of voters, or technically electors, will have said in this referendum on President Trump, he gets a thumbs down. And the lesson for this is, the lesson that we draw from this is that don't do what Donald Trump did. Because presumably if you do, then you won't get re-elected either. So historians will not have to deal with Donald Trump if he does not get re-elected. Speaking in terms of models and theories and all, Donald Trump will be seen as this outlier, this data point that's way off of the curve of predictability, because he will fail for re-election. He definitely, and I can speak with confidence on this one, as a presidential historian, if Donald Trump does not get reelected, he certainly will not be considered one of the great presidents. And by great here, I mean not great and good necessarily, but great and important. If he does get reelected, then all of a sudden, everything that Donald Trump did in his first 4 years becomes a model for other people. So don't bother reaching out to members of the other party. Dismiss those people who didn't vote for you. Just curry favor with your base, and you'll be fine. You can, if Donald Trump gets reelected, then the concept of credibility in a president will have gone away. Among the many innovations of the Trump presidency is the idea that the president's word should count for something. And Donald Trump has made very clear, I mean, just by his statements, the ones that contradict one after the other, and you don't have to choose which of the things that Donald Trump said were not true, but if he's saying two contradictory things, you know that at least one of them is not true. So the credibility of a president used to be one of a president's most prized qualities. If the president of the United States says this, then you can count on it. Or at least you know that he's going to feel compelled to try to live up to that thing that he said. One of the reasons that Lyndon Johnson felt obliged to escalate the war in Vietnam was that he felt that American credibility and his own credibility was on the line. If Donald Trump gets reelected, then credibility will not be seen as an important, at least not a deal-breaking criterion for the president. So I guess I've got until maybe 10 o'clock tonight or however long this election plays out to see who wins. And then, I'll either have to say that, okay, Trump is this innovative president. I mean, you don't have to like the new things that he did to acknowledge that these are different, these are new. I'll have to say, we got to take him seriously. And then he will be a model for future candidates and future presidents. If he loses, then that won't be the case. Joe Biden will be seen as the vote for, let's take things back to the way they were before Trump, of course, coming out of the Obama presidency. But Joe Biden has this long career of being a solid guy in politics. So we'll see. We'll all be smarter tomorrow or the next day or whenever day than we are right now on this subject.
Okay. There were a number of questions about the rest of your rules. Are they published anywhere, or do you have time to rattle them off? I don't want to spend the whole rest of the time on that, but.
Okay, I'll give you sort of a sneak preview of a couple of them. They're not published anywhere, in part because I'm sort of still working on them, in part because I haven't figured out where to publish them. But so the first law is that there are no laws, but there are patterns. The second is that it's complicated. It's always more complicated than you think. And I've sort of explained that. The third one says that great leaders have limited vision. And I'll briefly explain the essence of this. And this comes up all the time. We see it now. I'm getting it in reactions to my book on Abraham Lincoln and John Brown. And so my book is called The Zealot and the Emancipator. The Zealot is John Brown. The Emancipator is Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln is still considered to be the greatest of all American presidents because he held the country together during the Civil War and he ended slavery in the United States. And for that, he accomplished stuff that Americans have honored him for forever. Just as a matter of sort of political reputation, it didn't hurt his reputation that he didn't have to deal with the aftermath of the war. He was assassinated. So then he gets the credit that comes from being a martyr to the cause. But Abraham Lincoln, in his statements regarding race relations, causes many people today to, I feel, oh my gosh, how could he say such a thing? Abraham Lincoln, for example, said that just because I don't think that I want a black woman as a slave doesn't mean I want her to be my wife. And what he was trying to explain was that he was against slavery, but he didn't think that the races ought to be forced into a condition of social equality. Well, you listen to that today, and you kind of, you wince. Abraham Lincoln said, in fact, during the war, he took leaders of the African-American community, free leaders of the African-American community, many of them ministers, he took them aside and said, it would really help a lot if you guys would get out in front of a campaign to expatriate all free black people in the United States. Because I don't know, basically what he said is, I don't know what we're going to do with a whole bunch of free black people in a democracy. Because Lincoln knew that American public opinion was coming around to the idea that slavery is wrong, but it certainly wasn't to a point where, and therefore black people in this country ought to have full equality with white people. So Lincoln doesn't really pass muster with the modern liberal sensibility. But my third law states, great leaders have limited vision. My point is that Lincoln is the model of a great leader. He was not looking to the year 2020. He wasn't worried about what people in 2020 would think about him. He was worried in making progress one step at a time. If he had been looking to a day when black people and white people could legally marry, for example, and if he had said that in public, then he never would have gotten the Republican nomination. He never would have been elected president. He never would have been in a position to issue the Emancipation Proclamation and promote the 13th Amendment. So great leaders are always men and women of their time. Sometimes I cast this as progress comes by half steps, or sometimes the way I put it is that successful individuals always have at least one foot firmly in the present, wherever that present is. Thomas Jefferson, boy, liberals would like Thomas Jefferson because he says lots of good stuff, and especially all men are created equal. But darn, he was a slaveholder. What do we do with this? And so statues of Thomas Jefferson are being torn down. But when those statues come down, the people who take them down refuse to acknowledge, I'll just say it, Brands's third law. Thomas Jefferson was allowed to write the Declaration of Independence because he was a Virginian, and Virginia elected him to the Continental Congress because he was successful. And a measure of success in Virginia in the 1770s was wealth and the ownership of slaves. Or to put it another way, if Thomas Jefferson were the kind of person that liberals in the year 2020 could really wrap their arms around, he never would have written the most powerful statement ever to come from the pen of any American. All men are created equal. He couldn't live up to that, but the point is that progress comes a bit at a time. He was basically putting down a marker for subsequent generations to aim for. We're still aiming for that. But if you somehow want Thomas Jefferson to suit the present with all of its demands and expectations, then you would never get the Thomas Jefferson that did what he did on behalf of freedom and liberty for all people, eventually. I think we've run out of time.
So Dr. Brands, I thank you for a very illuminating and timely presentation.
My pleasure, Ed, and thank you to all of you who participated today.